Hello and welcome. This is a video about the Elephant Gambit. The Elephant Gambit is for black. It's a black defense, and it starts off with e4, e5, knight f3, and d5. D5 offers up a pawn on e5. White can capture the pawn on e5 with his knight, or he can capture pawn takes pawn. There's also a couple sideline variations such as knight c3, bishop d3, d4, and d3. Let's look over some main lines. Let's look at what happens when knight takes. There's two main moves here: bishop d6 and pawn takes pawn. Bishop d6 seems one of the most solid ways, as after d4, pawn takes pawn, you've gotten your pawn back, and you have a share of the center, and moves such as bishop c4 threatening f7, you can just take this knight, and moves such as queen h5, an intermediate move threatening mate, you can just play queen e7 and play can go from there. If he just takes back, pawn takes bishop, you can go into this endgame where white's a little bit worse, and so black has good chances. Alright, let's go back. That was after knight takes pawn on move 3. Okay, so knight takes pawn, we looked at bishop d6. Another way is just to take the pawn. But it seems that bishop d6 is one of the main lines according to the book I looked at on the Elephant Gambit. I found this book on the internet. I think it might have been from chess.com. And it's a free ebook. I've looked for it again recently and I can't find it anymore. So I'm not sure what happened to it, but it is a good ebook on the Elephant Gambit. I recommend it if you're interested in this opening. Alright, let's continue. So after knight takes pawn, we looked at bishop d6. That's one of the main lines. And pawn takes pawn is another way. Pawn takes pawn is another way to go about this variation. One of the main things you want to watch out for is after you have this center with e4, d3 is often going to be played, followed by knight c3 to try to pressurize your center here. And so you want to be able to be aware of times when sometimes you can play f5. Oftentimes in the book they say f5 is dubious. For example, the knight here on e5, it would be dubious now because of queen h5 check. But there are situations where you can play f5, and it does help to hold the center more. I've found out through my games. Okay, so now let's look at some other alternatives. Let's look at pawn takes pawn. This is one of the main moves right here, and you have two variations. You can push the pawn, attacking the knight with e4, or you can play bishop d6. And both are good. However, I kind of lean towards bishop d6 as leaning towards more positions that are favorable for black. Because of this, after you push the pawn, white's best move is actually queen e2. And oftentimes white's not going to find this. They're going to play knight d4, and black has a good game after queen takes pawn, getting his pawn back, attacking the knight, and gaining some tempo. Gaining some time. The knight can go. One variation you want to be watchful is after knight b5. The best square for the queen is e5, preparing bishop d6 to stop white from castling. Other moves for white here are knight b3, c3. You'll see played. So the main move after you push the pawn to e4, attacking the knight, is queen e2. And here there's a couple options. You can play queen e7 with the idea of playing g6 and bishop g7, knight f6 and castles. Or one of the main lines, the main line actually, is knight f6. And play can continue from here. Knight c3, they recommend bishop b7. Because if he takes the pawn, castle, and this pawn is hanging, you have development. The queen's going to have to move in order to make way for the king bishop. And so there's some compensation for the pawn. Alright, let's go back. So that's one of the main variations after e takes d and e4, queen e2. Now I don't play this variation I don't play e4 as much as bishop d6 on move 4, or on move 3 rather. And the reason why is partly because the book recommends bishop d6 as one of the main lines, and I've also found that I like holding on to my center more and preparing e4 in the future. For example, if he plays knight c3 here, protecting the pawn, I found that f5 can be a good way to hold the center and prepare development. Knight c3 isn't the most direct move, so I feel like after knight c3 you can take the time to play f5, and there doesn't seem to be much danger to your king side. Another common move for white here is to play d4, and then you can happily play e4, attacking this knight, and most likely the knight's going to jump into e5. This is probably one of the main lines you're going to notice most often. And here you want to try to set your pieces up to protect the pawn on e4. So for example, you're going to have moves such as knight f6, bishop f5, and knight d7. Knight d7 right away, attacking the knight on e5 is also an alternative, threatening to win back your pawn. However, after bishop e5, you're in an ugly pin. And so I normally would recommend, and the book recommends in these lines, is to play something like knight f6, and after knight c3, or bishop e5. If bishop e5, I use knight d7 or bishop d7 are two moves that you can play. So what else do we have here? Bishop d6, d4 is one move. You can push the pawn. After bishop d6, what else can white play? If he just plays bishop e5 check, I've seen. I often like to gain time with c6, taking the bishop. And what else can be played here? If knight c3, again, I've experimented with f5. I often like to play f5 when I can, because after d3, I can always push forward in the center, and I'll have a pawn on e4. After, say, knight f6, I can plan to push this knight away, and oftentimes you can have bishop sacrifices on h2, with a knight coming to g5 and a queen coming to h4. So be watchful for this. I've won many games with this idea. Oftentimes you can just play e4 and kick this knight away, and they'll castle, and you'll have bishop takes h2, bishop sacrifice. Okay, I think that covers about it. Did I go over the sidelines? Let's go over some sidelines actually. So after d5 on move 2, white can play knight c3. You might see, and there's two moves here. You can push the pawn forward, giving a closed position after knight e2, knight e6, knight g3, or as recommended in the book that the Elephant Gambit book that I've told you about, they recommend opening the center with pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and playing f5. Other moves such as d3. Here you can play moves such as pawn takes pawn. If he takes back with a pawn, then you can always trade queens, stopping white from castling and having a decent endgame. Or other alternatives, after you take the pawn, knight will capture on e5, and moves, and bishop c5 is an interesting move, because you have this tactic here. If he doesn't play it right, if you play something like bishop e2, then you have bishop takes f2, king takes, and queen f6, winning the knight. Bishop d3, another alternative. f5 is what they recommend, because if pawn takes pawn, you fork a piece. And if knight takes pawn, you have a nice center attacking the bishop. You do want to watch out for queen h5. And in this position, you can play g6, because after knight takes pawn, knight f6 attacking the queen, queen h4, pawn takes bishop, and if knight takes rook, you have queen e7 check with mate to follow. So that's bishop d3. What else? You can see d4, and this can often transpose. Pawn takes pawn is one way of playing it. However, another alternative that they recommend actually is one of the main lines is ed, because if ed, you have c5, holding on to your pawn, and if en passant, knight c6 developing, and you got this pawn in the center, it's isolated, so it's a bit weak, but you do have free movement for your pieces, and supposedly it's not supposed to be so bad. I haven't ran into these many sideline variations in my games. Normally I'll see the main variations, such as knight takes pawn and ed. Alright, that's my first video on the Elephant Gambit. I hope it gives you an introduction to the Elephant Gambit to hopefully play it. It's a if you're into attacking chess and you're into gambits, I'd recommend it for black. I first was accustomed to this gambit by King's Crusher, who I'm sure you've heard of on YouTube, who makes many chess videos, and he's been doing it for a long time. He's a great channel to check out if you haven't heard of him. And he's the first one I saw playing this Elephant Gambit, and he won many games on Blitz, and I thought it was interesting, and I found this ebook. And one of the main lines, again, is playing bishop d6. So bishop d6 is often a move that you'll play, developing your piece first, and preparing knight f6 and castles. Okay, thank you for watching this, and I hope you enjoyed it. See ya.